Much like the rest of the world, India was preparing for a fun-filled New Year's night. Images of fireworks from Sydney Harbour in Australia are always the first to ring in the new year and were already being cheered around the country. They had become a symbol of an expectation and the thrill of something new heading our way. Across major cities in India, evening peak hour traffic was building up early. As the sun began to descend into the hazy horizon, thousands were rushing back home to change and begin partying. No one knew a frightening crisis had begun to unfold over 3,000 kilometers away from India. A crisis that would leave millions sick or dead around the world. Hours before New Year's night, Chinese government officials were preparing to inform the World Health Organization that they had detected 27 cases of pneumonia by an unknown cause in the Wuhan city. The announcement was barely noticed. The Chinese said they were calling this pathogen COVID-19 and that they knew it spreads via airborne droplets. On the 11th of January, China informed that a 61-year-old man who had shopped at the Hunan seafood wholesale market had now died of this mysterious virus. Kerala's cultural capital, Thrissur, begins its day early. On the 30th of January, streets had begun to hum with people and eateries had come alive even as the sun began to peep out. A few hours later, Thrissur reported the first of a series of events across India that crippled the country and would continue to haunt us for a long time. The administration reported a student studying at the Wuhan University had returned home on vacation and fallen ill. Doctors treating him at the local hospital announced that he was India's first COVID-positive patient.
Around the time India reported its first case in Thrissur in Kerala, the world had already begun waking up to the scourge of the pandemic. In 20 countries, at least 7,500 cases had already been reported. But in India, life was normal. Cities were running fine, and there was absolutely no scare or fear visible on the streets.
India was still going about life normally. News of the first positive case in Thrissur was still not a big enough headline. But no one knew the flurry of activity that was already on at the Foreign Ministry office at Delhi South Block for days now. In mid-January, Indian embassy officials had alerted New Delhi about Wuhan's worsening condition and the local lockdown. The big worry, 650 of our citizens were now trapped in the epicenter of the world's deadliest outbreak. A day after the Thrissur announcement, government said there would be an emergency evacuation of Indians from Wuhan. This was the first sign the virus spread was building into something we could not dismiss. 3 days later, Kerala became India's first big worry. 2 more patients tested positive in Alleppey and Kasaragod. The state government went into a huddle. Hours later, coronavirus was declared a state calamity. At Delhi South Block, the concern had deepened into a crisis. News had come, deaths due to the mysterious virus in China had exceeded the death count due to the SARS outbreak. The Foreign Office declared all existing visas of Chinese nationals and foreigners who had visited China are being cancelled. India was preparing to cut itself off from the rest of the world.
On February 11th, the World Health Organization gave COVID-19 as its official name for the virus. The agency struggled with how to deal with the pandemic and kept changing its position on how the world should deal with it. Back in India, the government was readying itself for a massive logistical challenge of getting its citizens back home. Remember, most of the cities in Europe, as well as in other parts of the world, had started locking itself down, and there were hundreds of Indians who were trapped in those cities waiting for a chance to return home.
By February end, all Indians had been evacuated from Wuhan. But by the first week of March, cases began spreading outside of Kerala. A 45-year-old man from Delhi who had returned from badly affected Italy and another person from Hyderabad with a travel history to Dubai reported positive. The government assessed the virus was largely coming via air travelers and announced mandatory airport screening of travelers returning from high-risk countries. On March 3rd, the issue acquired a new importance. For the first time since the beginning of the emerging crisis, Prime Minister Narendra Modi commented on the issue. In a tweet, he asked citizens not to panic and said the ministries and states were working together to screen people arriving in India. Eerily, within 2 days of his assurance, India reported 22 fresh cases. Most had returned from an overseas trip. The threat was promptly upgraded. The government announced all passengers arriving into India will now be screened, a decision that stretched airport officials and created the first signs of chaos. By March 8th, nearly 100 countries around the world had reported at least one case of coronavirus, with the combined global figure crossing 1 lakh. 2 days later, 13 states of India also reported at least one case each and a total of 50 cases. 24 hours later, the world's worst fears came true. WHO declared coronavirus a pandemic. It meant it was a virus for which there was no known cure.
WHO has been assessing this outbreak around the clock, and we're deeply concerned both by the alarming levels of spread and severity and by the alarming levels of inaction. We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
On 12th of March, Karnataka's Kalburgi reported India's first death. It was also the day that the union government finally banned entry of all foreigners. India had begun to cut itself off from the world.
By mid-March, India had begun to take the threat of the virus a little more seriously. Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Delhi and several other states had started imposing localized restrictions, even though they were not as extreme. Meanwhile, the ICMR began its job of coordinating how to deal with the pandemic. It was something that they had never handled before, and the states had no idea of what to do. That's what required a cogent COVID crisis management plan, and that's where the ICMR's role became extremely critical.
As the weather turned warm and summers arrived, most in urban India knew things were worrying. Reports of doctors struggling to come to terms with the mystery virus were increasing. There were fears a mass outbreak could cripple our stretched medical care infrastructure. As news of patients dying while waiting for help in developed countries in Europe and the United States flooded in, the fears turned worse. There was absence of credible information and understanding of the virus and its virulence. On the afternoon of March 19th, a message came from the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister would be addressing the nation later that Thursday evening. Speculation mounted. So did theories over how bad the news was.
22 मार्च रविवार को सुबह 7 बजे से रात 9 बजे तक सभी देशवासियों को जनता कर्फ्यू का पालन करना है। इस जनता कर्फ्यू के दरमियान कोई भी नागरिक घरों से बाहर न निकले, न सड़क पे जाए, न मोहल्ले में या सोसाइटी में इकट्ठे हो, अपने घरों में ही रहें।
In a 28-minute address, Prime Minister Modi asked for a nationwide Janta curfew on Sunday, the 22nd of March. It was a voluntary curfew during which citizens were asked to stay indoors from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. He made one more appeal.
रविवार को यानी जनता कर्फ्यू के दिन शाम को ठीक 5 बजे हम अपने घर के दरवाजे पर खड़े होकर या बालकनी में या खिड़कियों के सामने खड़े होकर 5 मिनट तक रविवार को शाम को 5 बजे 5 मिनट तक ऐसे लोगों का आभार व्यक्त करें। और आभार कैसे व्यक्त करेंगे? ताली बजा करके, थाली बजा करके, घंटी बजा करके हम उनके प्रति अपनी कृतज्ञता व्यक्त करें, उनका हौसला बढ़ाएं, उनको सैल्यूट करें।
He wanted Indians to blow conches, clang utensils, or simply clap to thank and honor the frontline workers who were by now engaged in fighting the war against COVID. The request drew an overwhelming response across most cities. The curfew was successfully observed across cities, and people thanked COVID warriors in the manner the Prime Minister suggested. It was the day we discovered the Janta curfew was just a rehearsal for the real deal. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's office said he would address the nation again at 8 p.m. Fears of a drastic measure were coming true. After all, it is not often the Prime Minister addresses the nation twice in 5 days. As the nation sat glued to their television sets, a nationwide lockdown from midnight was announced. All activities and movements of people, except emergency and critical services, were being halted for 3 weeks.
आज रात 12 बजे से संपूर्ण देश में संपूर्ण लॉकडाउन होने जा रहा है। हिंदुस्तान को बचाने के लिए, हिंदुस्तान के हर नागरिक को बचाने के लिए, आपको बचाने के लिए, आपके परिवार को बचाने के लिए आज रात 12 बजे से घरों से बाहर निकलने पर पूरी तरह पाबंदी लगाई जा रही है। देश में ये लॉकडाउन 21 दिन का होगा।
The sudden announcement triggered panic buying of essentials across the country. Queues and freight tempers extended into midnight. From March 25th, trains had halted. Flights were grounded. Offices and markets across India were shut, and traffic would be off roads. For the first time since independence, every activity across the country had stopped. We had become a ghost country, and a noisy and buzzing India had gone silent. Over the next 5 days, the fear of the pandemic began to hit home. While many were being feted and praised for being our saviors and soldiers in white, others were being demonized. Authorities announced Nizamuddin in New Delhi had become a COVID hotspot. with a large number of positive cases concentrated in one area. The Delhi police then said they were hunting for over 5,000 of them, including many foreign nationals who had gathered for a religious congregation and had left the area for other parts of the country. It gave India the first use of the word super spreader.
The panic was of two types. Essential commodities could be running out because the factories had shut down and the movement of trucks was becoming increasingly difficult as India had locked itself out. But there was another bigger crisis brewing. Hospitals were struggling with numbers of patients streaming in, and there was a shortage of testing kits. Even paramedic staff and the support staff like ambulance drivers were not in as many numbers as possibly were required. This required the nation to go into a war mode. It was a war against an enemy that was unseen and unknown. India was now beginning to fight a long war.
With a national curfew in place, police forces were working round the clock and in full strength to ensure compliance.
कोई दिक्कत नहीं है सर, कम से कम लॉकडाउन का पालन करें, आप लोगों को नम्र निवेदन है.
From across India, images of policemen meting spot punishment to jaywalkers and those out on fun drives, often using heavy-handed measures to enforce the curfew, began streaming in. Shops that were open in violation of orders were dealt with in ways that led to instances of frayed tempers and prosecutions. Movement of goods began getting impacted as permissions for interstate goods transport were complicated and tough, and drivers couldn't be reached. States had shut down their borders, and the few trucks carrying essentials faced massive supply delays. Stretched to the limits, with threat and worry of infection mounting, pressure on the police began to worsen. But if they thought enforcing a 3-week national lockdown was a nightmare, a worse crisis was in store. It was barely a week since the nation had shut itself down, and it was this image that hit India hard. A tired infant sprawled on a suitcase, being dragged by parents trying to walk back home via a rough highway. This image symbolized one of the biggest humanitarian crises that had hit the country post-partition. A crisis that the government had neither anticipated nor prepared for. Lakhs of migrant workers employed in hundreds of occupations across all the major cities and industrial towns were suddenly out of work and were fast running out of their meager savings. The daily wagers were the worst hit. With no money and no place to get food, hundreds and hundreds of them began walking thousands of kilometers to head back to their hometowns. Some paid princely amounts to hitch a ride on goods carriers that were being allowed with special permits. Police were struggling across states. Some used force and violence, others barricaded state borders, causing skirmishes. It created a perception that India didn't care for its poor and marginalized. While the migrants' numbers just kept growing, they walked, cycled, or simply drove auto rickshaws to return home. The government dithered on allowing authorized movement. States had begun making requests for the government to allow buses and trains for bringing migrants back home. But the visuals of mass reverse migration were unnerving. State governments were asked to set up camps and provide free food. In some areas, Good Samaritans and NGOs began helping out the badly distressed migrants. As chaos mounted, the government announced over 1 lakh crore rupees as aid for providing free food grains and for support to workers in the unorganized sector. Despite the measures, the numbers and needs of the migrants were far higher than the relief that was being arranged. The nation was locked up at home. Everyone was scared, frustrated, and stressed. As the crisis spiraled, Prime Minister Modi addressed the nation again and made his second unusual appeal. He asked every Indian to thank COVID warriors and show solidarity with them by giving 9 minutes of their time at 9 p.m. on April 5th by switching off lights and lighting diyas or torches.
5 अप्रैल रविवार को रात 9 बजे मैं आप सबके 9 मिनट चाहता हूं. ध्यान से सुनिएगा. 5 अप्रैल को रविवार को रात 9 बजे घर की सभी लाइटें बंद करके घर के दरवाजे पर या बालकनी में खड़े रहकर 9 मिनट के लिए मोमबत्ती, दिया, टॉर्च या मोबाइल की फ्लैशलाइट जलाएं. मैं फिर कहूंगा, मोमबत्ती, दिया, टॉर्च या मोबाइल की फ्लैशलाइट 5 अप्रैल को रात को 9 बजे 9 मिनट तक जरूर जलाएं.
Once again, India responded. For 9 minutes, city after city responded with a mass thank you, lifting the spirits of a very scared country.
The crisis had actually worsened. States with inferior health apparatus started showing signs of strain, with a shortage of doctors, hospital beds, and even ambulances not being around, getting reported more frequently. Many instances of patients being refused an admission into a hospital and doctors just not being able to cope with the load of the patients were getting reported. The ICMR began holding daily briefings, official communication by the government, which became one of the most watched events simply because it was the most critical for the future of India.
It was fast becoming a twin crisis. The mass reverse exodus from cities was taking a toll on the system and was a social and health nightmare. But the poor hospital infrastructure and supplies of medical equipment was making it worse. Testing labs were few and were running short of COVID test kits. Beds were getting filled up rapidly and isolating patients was proving challenging. Queues at designated COVID hospitals were growing and there weren't even enough life-saving ventilators or oxygenated ICU beds. Even protective PPEs were in short supply, leading to hundreds of health workers getting infected. As doctors and nurses tested positives, colleagues needed to be quarantined, making the shortage of professionals worse. A health disaster was looming. States began setting up dozens of temporary hospitals by taking over large buildings and grounds. Isolation wards were set up in hundreds of government buildings and institutions. The central government kept announcing additional bed capacities, including readying train coaches as hospital wards. Increase in the supply of testing kits was now a top priority as well. A regular addition in testing labs by roping in the private sector was initiated and dozens of new labs began operating. Hospitals were asked to dedicate space only for COVID patients, even as all non-emergency medical treatment was disallowed. But the case count kept going up. The spread was rapid and systems were stretched. On April 14th, the Prime Minister extended the 3-week lockdown by another 2 weeks, but the COVID surge continued.
साथियों, सारे सुझावों को ध्यान में रखते हुए ये तय किया गया है कि भारत में लॉकडाउन को अब 3 मई तक और बढ़ाना पड़ेगा। यानी 3 मई तक हम सभी को, हर देशवासी को लॉकडाउन में ही रहना होगा।
By April end, India was touching the 35,000 COVID cases mark and had seen over 1,000 deaths. On the first day of May, the Home Ministry announced another extension of lockdown. But there was a change. The nation was color-coded depending on the number of infections. The worst affected were classified as red, followed by orange and green classifications. Minor relaxations were allowed in the green and orange zones, and the term containment zone became part of our daily lexicon. Despite some relaxation, bulk of urban India remained a large containment zone. Meanwhile, images of stranded and desperate migrants continued to stream in. With temperatures crossing 44 degrees and man choosing to walk in the heat, the government decided to allow special trains between states. Despite fears of thousands of migrants taking possible infections back to small towns and villages and actually aiding the spread, government announced 200 special Shramik trains to carry the stranded workers back home. The announcement led to chaotic scenes at many railway stations, with desperate workers rushing to board trains or find one for their family. Surat, Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, Hyderabad, Bengaluru were possibly the most impacted. Misinformation and a lack of a dedicated timetable added to the chaos. Migrants were unaware which train would leave, when, and for where. If the police was struggling already in enforcing the lockdown, this was an added nightmare. The government had mandated a process for keeping track of travellers. Registering thousands of travellers needed camps and police force to ensure a stampede-like situation didn't arise. The special Shramik trains began to finally roll out, but the crisis would last weeks before the rush subsided. There was an unusual shortage triggered by the lockdown, and that became a talking point and added to the chaos in some cities. Like everything else, liquor sales had also stopped as India locked itself down. Many states said they were losing revenue, even as black marketing was thriving. On May 4th, the government allowed liquor shops to open outside containment zones. Chaos and unending queues formed outside stores selling limited stocks. Some stretched for hundreds of meters. Social distancing norms went for a toss, and police had to use force to disperse crowds. Ironically, all through the lockdown, queues hadn't quite built up for essentials in as many numbers as they did outside liquor stores. By now, another issue was building up. Thousands of Indians who were abroad were left stranded when the lockdown was announced. They needed to be brought back. On the 7th of May, the first of the Vande Bharat mission flights was announced. The government would send special planes to countries and get its citizens back into India.
Early May was India's lowest point of the year. Aside of the massive surge in the numbers, the issue was now beginning to take an emotional toll. Reports of job losses, factories shut down, unemployment and salary cuts were coming in every single day. But that was not all. Virtually everybody who knew someone had somebody dying in their family. This was a year that India would want to forget, and in a hurry.
By mid-May, India's positive case count touched 1 lakh. 3,000 deaths were reported from across states. In major cities, heart-rending images of queues outside cremation and burial grounds began trickling in. Maharashtra, and especially Mumbai, as well as the National Capital Region, emerged as two worrying epicenters. The two cities ran India's economy and governance. States like Gujarat, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Maharashtra, and Punjab were badly affected as well. In some states, there were allegations the authorities were hiding the numbers. Economic losses mounted, and jobs were getting lost as businesses collapsed. The panic and fear kept deepening. With the COVID curve not flattening, as well as the government would have liked, the Home Ministry announced another 2-week extension of the lockdown on May 17th. Restless opposition parties began putting pressure on the government for not doing more to mitigate the crisis aside of extending lockdowns. India was now the country that had locked itself down for the longest duration anywhere in the world. Over the next 2 weeks, the Finance Ministry announced a series of economic packages called the Atmanirbhar package. The package was meant as a relief to distressed sectors of the society by providing credit relief or capital support for restarting operations. But that wasn't proving to be easy. The pandemic continued to rage on. In mid-May, the central government realized the critical role of civic bodies and state governments in controlling the pandemic. Central teams began visiting the worst-hit spots to help firm up city-wise and focused crisis management strategies. The focus had turned to civic governance. Places like Mumbai's Dharavi, Asia's largest slum that had become the biggest scare because of massive density of people, were given a dedicated SOP. India also stepped up on manufacturing PPEs indigenously, and the testing kit supply situation improved as well. As the month neared the end, a key move towards semblance of normalcy came on the 25th of May. After a hiatus of 2 months, passenger flights partially resumed operations under strict safety protocols. Only 30% of the regular flights were allowed. On day 1, chaos prevailed at major airports like Delhi, Mumbai, Bengaluru, and Hyderabad, as several cancellations were reported. But operations turned smoother as India learned how to fly in a pandemic. June began with grim news. India was now the 7th most infected country in the world. But the first signs that the country was regaining some confidence to deal with the crisis were visible as well. The government announced what it called Unlock India Phase 1. Lockdown restrictions were imposed only in containment zones, while selected activities were now permitted outside them. Interstate travel was relaxed, and malls, restaurants, and hotels were allowed to open, but states were empowered to impose harsher restrictions should the situation demand. Despite the centre allowing it, many states chose statewide lockdown extensions, the harshest measures being in the worst affected state of Maharashtra. On June 5th, the WHO revised its global advisory saying masks should be worn in public mandatorily as a safeguard against the spread. The government took the advisory seriously. and the sight of people on streets with masks on became common, as fines and prosecutions for not wearing them rose. Throughout June, India kept making headlines for its rising numbers and for continuously climbing the charts of one of the most affected countries. On June 12th, we became the fourth worst affected country with over 3 lakh cases. The number climbed further to over 5 lakh by June end.
With the process of unlocking having now begun, India shifted its course towards rebuilding the economy. Companies had reported devastating losses and massive unemployment, and that issues dominated the headlines all through the last 4 months. But for the first time, India had begun to live with the pandemic. Life was showing its first signs of returning to normalcy.
By July, the term new normal was applicable virtually everywhere. Majority of corporates had mastered the work from home rule, online education for schools and colleges was picking up, and many other customized online solutions had already become a habit by now. India was also beginning to learn to erratically follow social distancing and mask protocols as a way of life. It wasn't always effective or successful, but temperature checks at entrances to restaurants, malls, shops and offices, and contactless services were now the norm. By mid-July, India got the best news of hope since March. Major countries around the world were racing towards finding a vaccine for COVID. UK, Russia, United States, and China had all announced advanced stage progress and clinical trials. On 15th of July, clinical trials for an indigenous vaccine developed by Bharat Biotech in collaboration with the National Institute of Virology and ICMR were given a go-ahead. In fact, many in India were ecstatic that the government had given an August 15th deadline for the rollout, a piece of news that was promptly dismissed by scientists who said that vaccines can't be put on a rigid deadline. Over the next several weeks, the government continued to focus on unlocking India, with rescuing a gasping economy becoming the prime focus. More businesses and operations were allowed to open in Unlock 2 and 3, even as the ban on large gatherings continued. With enhanced bed capacity and greater understanding on how to implement protocols, patient load was getting managed better than before. On July 17th, the government announced the creation of bilateral bubbles between defined international destinations, and international air travel between selected countries began. By July end, authorities were confident to even announce dates for the Indian Premier League in Dubai, the first time any Indian sportsman would be seen in action since March.
By August, the first signs of the pandemic slowing down were actually getting visible. Some of the states were showing a much lower doubling rate than ever before, and that allowed the government to actually reopen more businesses and services. But August became important for one other reason. There were at least 5 variants of the vaccine that were on its way. It's the best news that India had heard the entire year. It was time for India to become normal. It was time for Indians to realize that the pandemic can be fought. India was now on its way.
You know, normalcy has returned when Parliament resumes work and elections arrive. The monsoon session began under the shadow of the pandemic. Members occupied galleries of both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha to increase distancing and split the day to utilize the space. On September 25th, the Election Commission said elections would be held in Bihar as scheduled, triggering fears of a mass spread because of rallies and crowds.
General elections to the Legislative Assembly of Bihar shall be conducted in 3 phases. In first phase, 71 assembly constituencies in 16 districts, including most of the LWE districts, will go for poll. In second phase, 94 assembly constituencies in 17 districts will go for poll. In third phase, 78 assembly constituencies in 15 districts will go for poll.
As the critical festive season arrived, doctors and scientists began warning about a second wave if safety wasn't practiced. For a period of 3 weeks, it appeared we had frittered away the gains. India reported over 90,000 fresh cases daily for over 7 days in a row. Even Parliament got impacted. Several members reported positive and a cabinet minister died, triggering a decision to curtail the session. At least 4 other ministers had to be hospitalized after testing positive. But with a consistent 90% plus recovery rate, we were beating the virus better than many in the developed countries. Bihar saw off its 3-stage polls without following most of the guidelines and norms set by the Election Commission. A thrilling result-day seesaw battle ended with Nitish Kumar getting reinstated as the Chief Minister. Strangely, despite massive callousness, the pandemic did not show signs of a surge in Bihar. But in Delhi, the situation was going the other way, with Dussehra and Diwali and other festivals increasing crowds and infections. With the annual menace of pollution and dipping temperatures, the NCR region was officially put on the highest alert as cases began to rapidly rise again. Governments went into a huddle and citizens were warned of harsher measures if they did not follow safety norms. In virtually every conversation and speech, Prime Minister Modi began talking about the progress of the vaccine. It was a shield every Indian was desperately waiting for. From addressing chief ministers of states to calling for all-party meetings, the Prime Minister kept asking everyone to be ready for the challenge of inoculating every Indian. On November 28th, he decided to fly down to visit 3 of the labs currently working on the vaccine research. By the first week of December, the government began hinting at the timeline of the vaccine rollout. India's shield was weeks away, it was announced. The year 2020, a year of misery and despair. A year during which over 140,000 Indians lost their lives to the virus and millions suffered massive economic and emotional distress. But it was also a year that belonged to thousands of heroes and saviors in white, who worked round the clock to save human lives. And much like the rest of the world, it's a year India would want to erase from its memory forever. With a silent hope and wish, 2021 will be a year to look forward to.